3 months after the end of the war in the European theater, the Soviet Union declared war on the Japanese Empire on 8th of August 1945. They successfully crossed the border with the Korean Peninsula on August 15th and liberated Pyongyang on 24th of August. They settled approximately in the middle of the peninsula. In the Moscow Conference of December 1945, the United States and the Soviet Union decided to administer Korea together and then demobilize their forces after 5 years. This effectively created the Soviet-backed Communist Democratic People's Republic of Korea (DPRK), or more easily North Korea, and the US-backed Republic of Korea (ROK) or South Korea. This solution was not much appreciated by the Korean population because after a Chinese and then Japanese occupation, they only want to be free. In order to avoid riots or anti-Soviet revolutions, the Communists appointed a Korean leader as head of Communist Korean government. The 33-year-old veteran of Korean resistance against Japanese, the Chinese resistance against Japanese, and Red Army officer Kim Il-sung was chosen. He arrived in North Korea on September 19, 1945. In December 1945, he became the communist leader of the part of Korea under Soviet influence. In February 1946, Kim Il-sung introduced a major series of reforms. More than half of the arable land that remained unused after the Japanese landowners fled was distributed to peasant families. 8-hour work shifts were standardized, all heavy industry was nationalized, and healthcare became free and available to all citizens. Hello and welcome to another Tank Encyclopedia voiced article. I'm your host, Tony, and today I will be covering the history of North Korean armor during the Cold War. If you like our videos and want to support us, please consider donating on Patreon or PayPal. All of the funds will be used to improve future Tank Encyclopedia content. Any help would be greatly appreciated. During the Chinese Civil War with Chinese nationalists and Chinese communists, the North Korea sent military equipment, estimated at 2,000 wagon trains of equipment and ammunition, and between 50,000 and 70,000 volunteers for the Chinese People's Army. At the end of the Chinese Civil War, the Chinese Communists won in December 1949, promising to Kim Il-sung to support the DPRK in the event of war with the Republic of Korea. The Korean People's Army Ground Forces (KPAGF) was founded in August 1947, composed of former Korean volunteers of the Red Army, the Chinese People's Liberation Army, and of the anti-Japanese Chinese Army or militias who fought the Japanese in the Korean Peninsula during the occupations. Thanks to the advisors and the considerable military aid from the Soviets, Kim built a large army, well versed in infiltration tactics and guerrilla warfare. From the late 1940s to June 1950, the Soviet Union supplied Kim's Korea with several thousand tanks, including a batch of about 170 Su-76M self-propelled guns, an unknown number of T-34-76, and 258 T-34-85s. Not only that, in addition to the tracked vehicles, the KPAGF also received several hundred BA-64 light armored scout cars and various artillery pieces, 45mm M1942, 57mm ZIS-2, 76mm ZIS-3 anti-tank guns, and different models of howitzers, as well as rifles and machine guns produced in huge quantities for the Second World War. In 1948, before supplies of Soviet vehicles arrived, the Soviets formed the 15th Tank Training Regiment. This training unit was equipped with only 2 T-34-85s and was staffed by a squad of about 30 tank officers, veteran Soviet volunteers. In May 1949, the regiment was reorganized and the cadets were all promoted to officers and NCOs of the newly formed 105th Armored Brigade. In the original plans, the 105th Armored Brigade was to serve as a breakthrough unit against South Korea and was, still is, considered the best trained and equipped armored divisions of the KPA. The brigade consisted of 5 regiments. The 107th, the 109th, and 203rd Tank Regiments were equipped with 40 T-34-85s each, although the ranks were only completed in October 1949. The 206th Motorized Infantry Regiment was equipped with Soviet-made trucks, and finally the 308th Armored Battalion had 16 Su-76M self-propelled assault guns. This amounted to a total of 120 medium tanks, 16 self-propelled vehicles, and an unknown number of trucks and about 6,000 soldiers. On the morning of June 25, 1950, the KPA forces received the order to attack. The first few weeks were a North Korean success, as the ROKA had no tanks and few 57mm anti-tank guns. In just 5 days, the North Koreans had captured Seoul and destroyed nearly 70% of the South Korean army. The first US troops to arrive in Korea as part of the United Nations intervention engaged the North Koreans on 5th of July 1950 in Osan, south of Seoul. Without tanks and with very few anti-tank weapons, which were found to be ineffective against Korean T-34s, from 5th July until early August, they too suffered heavy losses and were forced to retreat along with the ROKA. In August, US, UN, and South Korean forces were entrenched along the Pusan perimeter, the last unoccupied part of the Korean peninsula, with a perimeter of only 230 kilometers. The USAF, United States Air Force, began an intense series of raids aimed at hitting sensitive structures under the command of the KPA, making supply operations to the front line practically impossible during daylight and drastically weakening the North Korean troops at the front. During the Battle of Pusan Perimeter from 4th August to 18 September 1950, the North Koreans lost 63,000 men, including dead, wounded, missing, and prisoners, 239 T-34s, and 74 Su-76Ms. For their part, the UN troops stuck in the Pusan pocket were reinforced by about 180,000 soldiers and about 500 tanks, losing during the defense 60,000 soldiers, 40,000 of the ROKA, and only 60 M24 Chaffee, M4A3 Sherman, and M26 Pershing tanks. After this, the KPA forces suffered a period of continuous defeats. UN troops then landed behind North Korean lines in Incheon, forcing the North Koreans into a disorganized retreat and the loss of many soldiers. On 25 September 1950, Seoul was reconquered, the South government was restored, but it was not enough. On 30 September, General MacArthur, in command of US and UN troops in Korea, received a dispatch from the White House stating that he could invade North Korea beyond the 38th parallel. On 1 October, US troops opened a passage and penetrated into North Korea, followed by ROKA and UN troops. The unstoppable UN troops conquered Pyongyang, capital of the DPRK, on 19 October and pushed further north towards the border with China. During the fighting, about 200,000 PKA soldiers were wounded or killed and another 135,000 taken prisoner, in addition to losing another 313 tanks, almost all T-34-85s. On 19 October 1950, the troops of the Chinese People's Volunteer Army (PVA) crossed the border between China and Korea, while the Soviet Union would limit itself to providing equipment to both KPA and the PVA. 25 October 1950 was the day when Chinese troops fought for the first time in the Korean War, in the Battle of Onjong against ROKA. This lasted until the 29th with a great victory for the Chinese. On 1 November, the Chinese encountered US troops at Unsan, defeating them and bringing the UN advance to a standstill. The operations resumed in January, with the North Korean and Chinese troops reconquering Seoul on the 4th January 1951. However, because of the scarce supplies of ammunition, food, and fuel, they could not advance much further, conquering the city of Wonju and pushing not much further south. On the 25th January, the Americans launched Operation Thunderbolt, which lasted until 11th February 1951. This led to the recapture of Wonju and the establishment of UN forces on the Han River. After Operation Thunderbolt, there were Operations Killer 11th February to 6th of March 1951, which led to the crossing of the Han River, and Operation Ripper 7th March to 6th of April, which led to the reoccupation of the city of Seoul, the fourth and last occupation in less than a year. In these battles, the PVA alone lost 53,000 men. In the period between April and May 1951, the PVA and the KPA launched another offensive that cost China 102,000 men, including wounded, dead, and captured out of 700,000. Another 78,000 soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured in the UN counteroffensive that brought the front line to just north of the 38th parallel from July 1951 to July 1953. From this point, there were no more major battles but simple border skirmishes as had taken place before the war, with almost continuous exchange of artillery fire. The few battles that were fought were the Battle of Punch Bowl, fought between August and September 1951, the Battle of Hill 266 between June 1952 and March 1953, and the last Chinese offensive launched in June and July 1953. At first, this led to a minimal advance which was quickly blocked and driven back by the UN. The attack cost China the lives of 25,000 soldiers in addition to 40,000 wounded, while the UN troops suffered 14,000 casualties. The Armistice was signed on 27 July 1953, and both the DPRK and the Republic of Korea claimed and still claim to have won the war. With the Armistice of 1954 came the exchange of prisoners of war, the corpses of the dead soldiers, and the creation of the Demilitarized Zone (DMZ) along the former Korean border, the 38th parallel. Since the Korean War, there have been dozens of incidents involving the Democratic People's Republic of Korea and the Republic of Korea, at a rate of about 2 per year in the nearly 4 decades from the end of the Korean War to the end of the Cold War, which have caused thousands of deaths of Americans, South Koreans, and North Koreans. And that's it for this video. If you liked it, please leave a like and subscription. You can find more information related to North Korean AFVs through the full article, which is linked in the description. If you like what we are doing and want to let us continue working on these videos, please consider donating on Patreon or PayPal. All of the funds will be allocated to improving our articles and videos for you. Until next time, keep us in your sights.